In the middle of the 14th century, a quiet horror swept across the Eurasian continent. It did not announce itself with the thunder of marching armies or the sudden catastrophic shock of an earthquake. Instead, it arrived silently, riding inside the bellies of fleas, nestled in the fur of black rats, and carried along the very arteries of commerce that had linked the medieval world together. Within 5 brief years, this invisible traveler, a bacterium now known as Yersinia pestis, would erase up to half the population of Europe, unspooling the social, religious, and economic fabric of an entire civilization. The story of the Black Death does not begin in the grand cities of Western Christendom, but thousands of miles to the east, on the vast, sun-bleached steppes of Central Asia. For centuries, the bacterium had existed in quiet equilibrium among wild rodent populations, particularly marmots, living in the high plateaus. In the early 1300s, subtle shifts in the global climate, a cooling trend that brought droughts to the grasslands, forced these wild rodents out of their traditional habitats in search of food. They came into contact with commensal black rats, creatures that lived in close proximity to human settlements. At the same time, the Asian continent was bound together under the vast umbrella of the Mongol Empire. The Pax Mongolica had secured trade routes stretching from Beijing to the shores of the Black Sea. Merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and envoys traveled along the Silk Road with unprecedented speed and frequency. Along this vast logistical highway, grain, silk, and spices moved west, and with them moved the infected fleas. By 1346, the contagion reached the Crimean Peninsula, a critical crossroads where eastern overland trade routes met the maritime networks of the Mediterranean. At the center of this hub was Kaffa, a fortified, wealthy Genoese trading post perched on the edge of the Black Sea. A Mongol army under the command of Khan Janibeg laid siege to the city. As the siege dragged on, pestilence broke out within the Mongol camp, felling soldiers by the thousands. Early chroniclers recorded that Khan Janibeg ordered the diseased corpses of his soldiers to be launched over the city walls using trebuchets, seeking to rout the defenders out of their stronghold. Whether this represented the first instance of biological warfare or whether infected rats simply slunk through the city gates, the result was immediate and fatal. Inside the crowded, walled city of Kaffa, the disease took hold. Terrified Genoese merchants fled to their ships, raising anchor and setting sail for home. They believed they were escaping the horror behind them. In truth, they were carrying it in their holds. In October of 1347, 12 Genoese galleys crept into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. When the locals went down to meet the ships, they found a nightmare waiting at the docks. Most of the sailors were dead at their oars. Those still breathing were gripped by high fevers, tormented by agonizing swellings in their armpits and groins, and covered in black, necrotic spots. The Sicilians quickly recognized the unnatural danger and drove the ships out of the harbor with burning arrows and stones. But the damage was already done. Fleas had leaped from the ship's ropes to the docks, infected rats had scurried ashore. Messina was compromised, and within weeks, the death rate in Sicily exploded. From Sicily, the plague moved with terrifying efficiency along the maritime highways of the Mediterranean. It struck Genoa and Venice in early 1348, the two great commercial superpowers of the era. From these bustling ports, the disease traveled inland, following the river valleys and trade roads like a slow-burning fuse. It moved north into Tuscany, crossing the Apennine Mountains to fall upon Florence and Siena. It radiated west along the coastline to Marseille, moving swiftly up the Rhône Valley into the heart of France. By summer, it had crossed the Iberian Peninsula and boarded merchant vessels bound for the British Isles, making landfall at the tiny Dorset port of Melcombe Regis in June 1348. The speed of the transmission was accelerated by the dual nature of the infection. The primary form was bubonic plague, transmitted by the bite of an infected flea. Once inside the human host, the bacteria migrated to the lymph nodes, causing them to swell into agonizing, egg-sized masses called buboes. If the bacteria entered the bloodstream, it triggered septicemic plague, causing rapid tissue necrosis and organ failure, killing victims within hours. Worse still was the pneumonic variation. When the bacteria settled in the lungs, It could be transmitted directly from person to person through microscopic droplets spread by coughing. No vector was needed, a single breath in a crowded room was enough to pass a death sentence. Medieval society possessed no scientific framework to understand what was happening. The microscopic world lay centuries beyond their vision. Medical knowledge in the 1300s was still anchored in the ancient Greek and Roman theories of Hippocrates and Galen, which posited that health was governed by a balance of four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Physicians believed the plague was caused by miasma, foul, corrupted air released from decaying organic matter, stagnant swamps, or unseasonable planetary alignments. In 1348, the medical faculty at the University of Paris formally declared that the outbreak was the result of a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius. Because doctors misapprehended the cause, their remedies were entirely futile and often harmful. Bloodletting and cupping were widely prescribed, further weakening patients who were already in septic shock. Pustules were lanced and cauterized with hot irons, inflicting agonizing pain without benefit. To fight the poisonous miasma, people burned aromatic woods, carried pomanders filled with ambergris or dried flowers, and washed their homes with vinegar. Physicians, recognizing their own powerlessness, were caught in a profound professional crisis. Many fled the cities alongside the aristocracy. Those who stayed donned heavy leather gowns and primitive hoods equipped with bird-like beaks filled with dried herbs, trying desperately to filter the air they breathed. They became spectral symbols of impending death, helpless observers to an uncontrollable slaughter. As the mortality rate climbed, urban life shattered under the psychological weight of the crisis. In crowded cities like Florence, Venice, Paris, and London, human density transformed neighborhoods into death traps. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, witnessing the collapse of Florence in 1348, recorded that the conventional bonds of human society dissolved entirely. Parents abandoned their dying children, husbands deserted their wives, brothers refused to visit sick brothers. The basic instinct of self-preservation flattened every social obligation. The rhythms of daily life ground to a halt. Shops were shuttered, fields left untended, and municipal governments collapsed as councillors died or fled. The grand architectural projects of the era, such as the ambitious expansion of the Cathedral of Siena, were abandoned mid-construction, their unfinished stone walls left standing as permanent monuments to the sudden interruption of human history. The sheer volume of the dead overwhelmed the sacred rites of medieval Christianity. Traditional burial was considered crucial for the salvation of the soul, requiring a priest, a proper shroud, and consecrated ground. But within months, churchyards were filled to capacity. In cities across Europe, municipal authorities were forced to dig massive open trenches. Bodies were stacked in layers, covered with thin coats of dirt, like cargo packed into the hold of a ship. When the clergy themselves died in disproportionate numbers, having received constant exposure while administering last rites, the church issued emergency decrees permitting laypeople, and even women, to hear the final confessions of the dying. In many places, even this proved impossible. Countless individuals died alone in their homes, their deaths discovered only days later when the stench of decomposition drifted into the empty streets. Beyond the physical devastation lay a profound spiritual crisis. To the medieval mind, everything on earth occurred within the scope of divine providence. A catastrophe of this magnitude could only be understood as the manifestation of God's supreme wrath, a punishment visited upon humanity for its lingering sins. As prayers, processions, and mass pilgrimages failed to stem the tide of dying, public hysteria took hold. Some turned to extreme hedonism, deciding that if life was fleeting, it should be spent in reckless indulgence. Others turned to radical acts of self-mortification. In 1349, thousands of men and women joined the movement of the Flagellants, wandering from town to town across Germany, the Low Countries, and Switzerland. Dressed in white robes marked with red crosses, they gathered in town squares to whip themselves with leather thongs tipped with iron spikes, chanting hymns and begging for divine mercy. They viewed their suffering as a sacrifice to appease God. Initial public sympathy for the Flagellants soon turned to dread. The movement grew increasingly radical, attacking the authority of the Catholic Church, claiming that their own blood could cleanse sin, and inciting violence wherever they marched. Desperate to find a human culprit for an invisible killer, medieval populations sought scapegoats. Suspicion quickly settled upon marginalized groups, most notoriously the Jewish communities of Central and Western Europe. A baseless, terrifying rumor spread that Jewish people had poisoned the public wells in a deliberate plot to destroy Christendom. What followed was a campaign of horrific violence. Despite official bulls issued by Pope Clement VI, who correctly pointed out that Jewish communities were dying from the plague at the exact same rate as Christians, mobs descended upon Jewish quarters. In Basel, Frankfurt, Mainz, and Cologne, Jewish populations were rounded up, tortured into false confessions, and murdered. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, before the plague had even reached the city, over 900 Jewish citizens were burned alive in their own cemetery. The vibrant Jewish communities of the Rhineland were virtually annihilated, driving survivors to flee eastward into Poland and Lithuania, fundamentally altering the demographic map of Europe for centuries. By the time the initial wave of the Black Death began to recede in 1352, the world was fundamentally altered. Historical estimates suggest that between 1347 and 1351, Europe lost between 30 and 60% of its total population. In absolute numbers, an estimated 20 to 50 million human beings perished in under 5 years. Entire villages were permanently abandoned, their names erased from maps. In England alone, over 3,000 settlements were lost to history, swallowed by returning forest and scrubland. Yet, as the smoke cleared from the mass graves, a strange and unexpected reality emerged. The sudden, catastrophic drop in population turned the traditional medieval hierarchy upside down. Before 1347, Europe had been overpopulated. Land was scarce, rents were high, and labor was cheap. Serfs were bound to the soil, entirely dependent on the feudal nobility who controlled the land. After the plague, the equation inverted overnight. Land was suddenly plentiful, but labor was extraordinarily scarce. Fields lay fallow because there was no one to plow them, crops rotted in the ground because there was no one to harvest them. Surviving peasants quickly realized that their labor had immense value. When lords tried to force peasants to work for pre-plague wages, laborers simply refused, moving to neighboring estates where landowners were willing to offer higher pay, better food, and lower rents. In response, monarchies across Europe tried to freeze the social order. In England, King Edward III issued the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, making it a crime for peasants to accept wages higher than those paid in 1346. These attempts to turn back the economic clock sparked fierce resistance. Decades of tension boiled over into massive agrarian rebellions, including the French Jacquerie in 1358 and the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and the radical cleric John Ball, English peasants marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom and the dismantling of the feudal hierarchy. Though the revolts were put down with brute force, the underlying economic reality could not be reversed. Serfdom began to wither away across Western Europe, replaced by a cash-based labor market that laid the early foundations of modern capitalism. The institutional church was similarly transformed. The clergy had suffered immense losses, and to fill the depleted ranks, the church had been forced to ordain young, inexperienced, and often uneducated priests. The sight of the church's total inability to stop the plague, combined with the visible corruption and lowered standards of the post-plague clergy, eroded the unassailable moral authority the institution had enjoyed for centuries. People began to seek a more personal, direct relationship with God, sowing the spiritual seeds that would, 2 centuries later, erupt into the Protestant Reformation. Art and culture were profoundly reshaped by the collective trauma. The idealizations of early medieval art were replaced by an obsession with mortality. Images of the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, appeared on church walls throughout Europe, depicting skeletons leading popes, emperors, merchants, and peasants alike to the grave. It was a stark, visual reminder that death was the great equalizer, indifferent to wealth, status, or power. Out of the ashes of the 14th century, a new European society began to take shape. The loss of human life was an unimaginable tragedy, yet the structural collapse it caused created space for something new. The scarcity of labor encouraged technological innovation, leading to the development of labor-saving devices in agriculture, mining, and printing. The restructuring of wealth created a broader middle class with disposable income, fueling demand for consumer goods and education. The Black Death was not merely an end, it was a violent, convulsive hinge in human history. It shattered the static, insular world of the High Middle Ages, breaking the shackles of feudalism and forcing a traumatized continent to rebuild itself. In the wake of the greatest demographic catastrophe humanity had ever known, the Old World died, and from its ruins, the first whispers of the Renaissance began to emerge.